Hey guys, it's M. And today we'll be reviewing Rage 2, a game I've wanted to talk about for a long time. For those of you unaware, Rage 2 is a Bethesda id Software made fast-paced shooter set in a post-apocalyptic world that came out in 2019. I ended up stumbling into it completely by accident a year or two ago, and have beat it multiple times since. And I've always had complicated feelings about it, even since my first playthrough. But the issues I had with this game were so complex and tended to mix with other issues I found, so I found it hard to structure a section-by-section review for this game, because one point would lead to me explaining another 5. But now, I feel I have a kinda good grasp on how I'm gonna handle it, and I can't wait to share my thoughts about this interesting piece of fiction. Two things of note. I will occasionally in sections be mentioning things only to expand upon them later. As I said earlier, my issues and praises are so compounded here, if I didn't do this and try to explain everything individually when it was first mentioned, we wouldn't get anywhere coherent. Second, as I say all the time, I'm not going to be blindly hating or defending this game. These will just be my own thoughts and opinions. And with all that out of the way, let's begin. Controls in combat here are interesting, and I feel the first thing we should discuss, as that's usually what you buy games like this for. As I said earlier, it's a Bethesda id Software made movement shooter, and I guarantee you the first thing that comes to mind when I say something like that is Doom 2016 or Doom Eternal. And you're not wrong for thinking in that direction. This game controls very similar to Doom Eternal. Fast-paced, high-sensitivity shooting that even took Eternal's famous double dash. Though before you write it off as a clone or a ripoff, it does manage to have its own flair. Our main character has the ability to force energy from his hand and fling people back, throw a gravity grenade, a portable shield, a force choke, or a ground slam. And on top of all those, you can access overdrive or rage mode that makes all of your attacks stronger. This helps differentiate it to the point where it does feel like it has its own identity, and it's pretty fun to mess around with. Though before you go thinking it's all sunshine and rainbows, they all aren't perfect. A non-mobile shield in a game this fast-paced is an odd design choice because you usually never be able to sit behind it without someone coming around and shooting you in the back, leading to you usually just throwing it down on enemies since the upgraded version of it can do damage to them. Shatter is amazing on normal, but on higher difficulties it won't even launch enemies back but just flinch them, which I feel ruins the point of it. It's not entirely useless as it can help you line up shots, but other than that it has the effect of a wet sneeze. The gravity shot feels odd. It can launch you in the air and help you get additional height, but I feel when the enemies are launched in the air, the combat's so fast paced you won't have time to sit down and aim at them as they float helplessly through the air. The others are fine. The ground slam is so simple there wasn't really much they could get wrong about it, and the force choke is okay. A bit weird to aim, but still one of the better abilities. There are a few others like Revive and Rush, but they're really simple and speak for themselves, so I feel I don't need to really go into those. And before I escape this point, I feel like I have to talk about the simple ability of just walking around. And Doom Eternal, Necromunda, honestly most games like this, your character is just naturally fast. There's no sprint button or anything, you just move at the speed you're at. In Rage 2 there's a walk and a sprint button, which you won't notice feels really off until you play this. It feels odd to do all this movement and then have to toggle sprint every time you hit a wall from a dash or you just want to quickly reposition yourself. It's a change to differentiate this game that I honestly wish they didn't make. Still on the subject of controls in combat, let's talk about the weapon choice. In Rage 2, you end up with a lot of quirky weaponry. We have a standard pistol, assault rifle, and shotgun. But after that, we get the grav dart launcher, an energy machine gun, railgun sniper, a missile launcher, and a revolver where when you snap, you set people on fire. These are the base weapons of the game, not including the DLCs, as we'll get to those later. While I do think they're creative, most of them are pretty bad. For starters, on the beginning of your playthrough on anything above hard, enemies will take too many shots to the body for the assault rifle or pistol to be viable. Headshots will one-shot, but unlike Doom, the enemies here are human, so the chances of you accurately landing multiple headshots to make these seem like great options is pretty much zero. The grav dart and fire revolver require you to shoot the target and then do a secondary tap to activate the bullets, so it's a bit awkward to use them in the more difficult arena encounters, as it takes a while to get value out of, well, shooting the enemy. The railgun sniper here isn't as good as the recon scope or the vortex rifle in Doom. If you fire from the hip, the recharge rate is pretty slow, and the AoE isn't large enough to make it a sensible option. When you scope it, it can charge, but unlike Doom's, the charge here is so slow it only feels viable against big bosses or enemies, which only make up about 7% of the game. The energy minigun startup is a bit too slow and it overheats a little bit too fast to be worth using most of the time. In overdrive, it becomes one of the best weapons in the game, but normally it's a bit too clunky to casually use. The rocket launcher seems like it should be good, but on higher difficulties, a direct missile can't even kill basic enemies in one hit. And disregarding that, it's just really slow to swap to. And unlike Doom, you have to reload. And that really breaks the flow of the fight, making it clunky and weird to use in 99% of encounters. The combat shotgun is the only gun that works well, like a gun. No matter what difficulty you're on, it's always a solid option, and the only gun that feels like it can kill things fast with no real downside. This is one of the biggest flaws with combat in this game. All of the guns except one have a very obvious downside you have to deal with, leading to you only using the shotgun for most of your encounters and making you want to avoid the others, as they all feel like a downgrade and it's immediately noticeable. There were multiple times I'd look at my weapon wheel in a combat encounter and go, that's it? As if I should have had more viable and valuable options. The fun concepts of the weapon felt like they got in the way of them actually being good. But before we completely get off this point, let's go into the throwables. There's your standard grenade, which I feel I don't need to explain. Though there is a fun mechanic here with them, which is when enemies throw grenades, you can bash them back. I initially ignored this mechanic on my first playthrough, but it's actually pretty strong and is really fun when it lands. Then there's the wing stick, which is pretty much a headshotting boomerang that's pretty powerful even on ultra nightmare difficulty. The only flaw with it is if it smacks a wall, it immediately breaks, which will happen way more often than you think it would. Also, it does have a feature where you can make it hit one person and then bounce to other people, but the game is so fast paced, you will have no chance to do this. Then there's the turret drone, and they're fine, I guess. They do what you'd expect them to do, and they don't have the largest health pool, but they can draw aggro from you. The enemies in Rage 2 are pretty basic, until we reach the DLC portion of this video. You're fighting variants of guys with guns, weird naked bald robot people, and mutants that will run up and slash you. Sometimes their weapons will change, but you pretty much deal with all of them the same, just by blasting them. They all have about the same health pool, and you don't ever really need to change tactics. While I appreciate the fact that they have a few different factions with different styles, dialogue, and designs, this makes combat feel very samey after a while, as they don't tend to have anything to make you change your gameplay style up like the Marauder, Conmaker drones, or things similar, but they do have great attention to detail. You can really get the vibe of any of these groups just by overhearing their conversations or seeing how they stand. And some of the small animations are really nice touches, like when you ground pound, some of them fall back and try to crawl away, and in replaying this game for a video, I threw a grenade and a raider jumped on top of it to protect his friends. Stuff like that lets you know while this isn't a flawless game, someone clearly cared. But back on to fighting, there's also elite enemies, but they're so rare they're barely worth talking about. The generic raider group has a guy with an assault rifle. He's healthy but barely moves, so he hardly changes anything. There's another big guy with a laser gun, and this enemy's really annoying when you do run into them because they shoot in random arcs, so it feels nigh impossible to avoid their projectiles. There's a big lady with a ginormous shield. Honestly, they switch up the combat the most as you can't shoot them from the front, but it feels like you have no good way of actually dealing with them, leading to them being more annoying than an actual challenge. You can't ever knock their shield out of their hands, you can't throw grenades at them as they'll just bounce them back at you, and you often run into them alongside clumps of normal enemies. So it often leads to you flailing shots or abilities at them until they die eventually. There's a minigun mutant who obviously shoots you with the minigun and can also shoot you with grenades from time to time, but he's pretty boring all things considered, and there isn't really much to say about him. The last one is an armored suit guy. They're fast and a bit tanky. They're probably the most inoffensive and fun special enemy to run into in this game. The only minor problem I have with them is hitting their chest can be a bit of a pain due to how bad many of the weapons are here, but I think them in themselves are fine. As for the bosses or special enemies, they range from average to awful. They have huge mutants, which I feel are fine. I feel their attacks are animated a bit weird, as when they swing at you, it feels like some of their animations are simply sped up, so dodging out of the way of their melee strings can feel odd, but you can get used to it. Their range moves are basic and not even much to discuss, and overall they're okay. They have a robotic variant that you run into later that basically works the same but has lasers. Depending on what weapons you have, he'll either be the worst fight in the entire game or an absolute joke. He has a weak point on his chest that's pretty hard to hit and requires multiple shots at that. But if you have the rocket launcher, you can shoot him once on any difficulty and it'll knock him down. Once he's kneeling, you shoot his back, rinse and repeat until his helmet breaks, where all you have to do is headshot him. And then he'll die. When you're prepared with the missile launcher, fine. But in a point we'll get to later, there's a good chance you won't even have that on your first encounter with this thing, causing him to practically take all of your bullets to put down. Authority sentries are one of the worst and appalling design choices in this entire game, but they are huge stationary turrets you shoot the weak spot of for a few seconds before you dodge or go behind something as they shoot. Rinse and repeat until they die. I don't understand how you could make a movement shooter like this and then go on to make this the most repeated boss fight. The most boring one where you only do two things. You just stand and then you shoot. They destroy the pace the rest of the game sets up, and they just shouldn't exist here. There's one special encounter with a sandworm which isn't great. You shoot its weak point and it squirms around a lot and can possibly fling you seemingly by a glitch if you're in a vehicle or a mech very far. It's just annoying. The thing never stops moving and it feels so bad to fight against. I'm shocked this was apparently added post-game, meaning they had time to work on this thing past launch and thought this was okay. There are a few more bosses in the game, but due to their story significance, we'll talk about them in their own section. Difficulty. Difficulty was handled awfully in this game and it's not even funny. Now, normal difficulty is fine. It feels it was made for those new to fast-paced movement shooters. But when you move up from that, you notice it wasn't handled like Doom Eternal. It was handled like Fallout 4. And to anyone who's played both of those games, you'd understand why this is concerning. You see, Doom Eternal's difficulty is fitted to give you a fair challenge. The enemies get more aggressive and their damage goes up, but their health doesn't change. This way, everything stays viable and it keeps the fast-paced nature of the game going. In Fallout 4 and most Bethesda games like that, their difficulty is moving up the health and damage sliders. In those other games, it's annoying, but it's relatively fine. But in a movement shooter like this, it causes the game to cannibalize itself. Most of the guns, which may I remind you, already weren't the best, might as well shoot BB pellets on this difficulty. On higher difficulties, like I said earlier, Shatter doesn't ragdoll enemies, turning it from an efficient tool to insta-kill small enemies and armored guys to a minor inconvenience for them. Slam goes from an amazing room clearer to a weak distraction. Then there's the enemy's damage scaling, which makes it feel like hell in certain areas. I want to remind you again, this isn't Doom. The enemies aren't shooting colorful fireballs or reactable energy blasts. They're shooting bullets from rifles, and there's a lot of guys with rifles. Your time to kill is very short, and if they hit you longer than 0.2 seconds, you're dead. If you're in a large vehicle, even a tank, if they hit you a few times, you'll die. It will leave you frustrated multiple times, and not in the way of you feeling like you made a skill mistake on your end, but more so in a really unfair way. RPG mechanics and powering up. Some may be wondering what I mean by this. You see, Rage 2 has a lot of upgrades and weapons you can unlock. Everything I've talked about except the pistol and rifle has to be unlocked from an arc. A big building sphere in the open world. My only problem with these are none except for the shotgun is mandatory. This in itself isn't necessarily an issue, but it becomes a problem when you fight any of the bigger enemies and you notice you're woefully unequipped. As I mentioned in the earlier section, if you fight these big brute guys with no rocket launcher, they could be some of the most grueling fights in game, taking practically, if not all of your resources to kill it. I understand rewarding exploration, but the fact that the story puts you against 4 or so big bosses like this, and there's a possibility you could just not have any heavy weapons to deal with them, was a horrible design choice. It makes all the arcs go from optional upgrades to pretty much mandatory to stand a chance. You may think you can just skip the ones that don't matter to you and grab the weapons you do like, but in the vein of this game, to be randomly fickle with its decisions, there's no indicator in game to actually tell you which arcs contain which weapon or upgrade, meaning unless you Google everything you want, you're most likely going to waste your time getting things you don't actually have any interest in. And needing to go to a resource outside of the game just to get certain things you should have run into on the main path anyways feels rough. This whole aspect of the game just feels awkwardly handled, for lack of a better word. I mentioned in the last section how you need to find these arcs in the open world. The open world here is very reminiscent of Ubisoft's open world design philosophy. 2% of the game is little towns you can shop at, 8% is small little locations and areas for you to explore, 10% is boss fights with the authority sentries or the other large mutants, and the remaining 80% are variants of outposts. Arcs, roadblocks, mutant nests, and everything else are just variations of combat arenas. While not necessarily a bad thing, as this is a movement shooter, so you're pretty much going to want to be shooting as often as possible, it does leave the world feeling pretty barren once you near finish the game. But to throw Bethesda a bone here, the world design is gorgeous. For a PS4 game, it looks amazing. And the world changing from a basic wasteland to a thick swamp to a desert makes you really feel like you're going on this region-spanning journey. But let's talk about how you get through that amazing spanning world. Vehicles. Vehicles, for the most part, are really weird to control. If you're going too fast, it's nigh impossible to turn the damn things. There will be times where you'll set a marker on your minimap and begin following it, for it to then give you a sharp turn literally no vehicle in the game is even capable of making, leading to you crashing into random things anytime you need to hard turn to the left or right. And not even including that, the collision in this game is generally weird. Sometimes you hit minor bumps and it'll send your vehicle out of control entirely, flip it over, or sometimes just bring it to a complete stop, even if it's a tank. Water heavily slows down pretty much all the vehicles here. So when you reach the swamp, one of the regions in this game, it's hard to navigate because on top of that, there's so many random bumps and shrubs littering the area. This is especially poorly timed because if you're playing this game normally, this will most likely be the final region for you, meaning the open world as a whole will end on a low note. There's also vehicle combat. It's fun and cool when it works and you're not dealing with all the other problems I mentioned, but I don't really have much else to say about it. Now you may notice notice I've been saying most vehicles. There is one vehicle in the game that is leagues above the others, and that's the Icarus. The Icarus is the one and only flying vehicle in this entire game. The fact that it can just float over and ignore everything else I mentioned makes it so much easier than using any of the other vehicles. I don't know why you'd use them after you unlock this. The story is pretty generic, all things considered. There's obvious good guys, which are your fellas, and obvious bad guys, which are the authority. Not much nuance unless you want to read dozens of data logs scattered around. It's not bad or anything, but it feels like another story in a shooting game with one or two quotable moments, and not anything standout. Its worst crime, though, is heavily wasting characters. Your sister-type character only has 2 cutscenes in the entire game, and later you end up on a mission to gather 3 important individuals, but they also only get like 2 or 3 scenes before they disappear. And past their first appearances, they most likely won't even be on screen and just call you. This game is quite lengthy if you blaze through it. It's around 10-ish hours, but if you're a completionist, it can be around 30-ish. You may wonder how there are so few story cutscenes in a game that long, and it's because a majority of the missions are just the outposts. Usually because one of the 3 leaders will tell you they're working on something, and this is a colorful way to tell you to clear out outposts until you hit level 5 with them, to which they'll give you their second quest, which will usually have you fight against the authority in some base. This makes it so a majority of the story quests are just you technically dicking around and clearing outposts instead of actual proper missions. It really makes the story feel like an afterthought at times, something duct taped onto the gameplay to the point where it's not hard to forget about it entirely sometimes. And I feel the authority really pay for this decision. They're relegated to only those 8 or so story-based missions, meaning most of the game you won't even be fighting them, but just the random raiders and mutants of the wasteland. The only real presence they have in the open world are the turns, which, like I said, are the worst fights in the game, so you'll most likely want to avoid them. It's hard to feel like they're this pressing world issue when you barely see them. This makes me especially upset because while I said they are generic, their leader, General Cross, is probably one of my favorite characters here. His design and line delivery really made me enjoy him as our main villain, and we only get to see him a few times. Now, what about the story exclusive bosses? Not including the giant mutant or the mech mutants that they recycle from the open world, the things that are meant to punctuate this journey. Well, the first is Cross himself, which unlike all the other bosses I complained about, he's pretty fun. It seemed like the devs thought that their fast-paced game deserved an actual fast-paced fight. Cross is pretty much able to keep up with you with his own powers, with things like blade arms, boosters, and wrist guns. It's such a far cry from all the other shitty bosses, it was a pleasant surprise to run into. Unfortunately, it's the only good boss fight in base game. The next time we see Cross in person is the final fight. They hype you up as if you're gonna fight him again, to which a big ugly mutant known as the Colossal Titan, no not that one, appears from under him and you have to fight it. And this is genuinely one of the worst boss fights in the entire game. You have to stop and wait for him to slam his hand down so you can shoot his weak points, while he'll occasionally shoot rockets down at you. It's embarrassing and almost feels like Baby's first boss fight. And maybe it wouldn't have been so bad if he didn't have so much health. It takes so fucking long to kill this thing on higher difficulties, it's actually insane. To be fair, this thing is shown in foreshadow in the first cutscene and once before in the Cross fight, but I guarantee you most players were focused on Cross and not the generic ugly monster behind him. And to go from the best boss fight hours earlier to this was disappointing. And like the level design at the swamp, it ends the game on a relatively low note. Now that we're done with the base game, let's talk about the DLCs. Cult of the Death God hardly counts as additional content. You can beat it in like 20 or so minutes, as it's only one mission. You go to a cave and do a mutant nest like normal, before you run into Nicholas Rain's armor, the protagonist from the first game, and a unique mutant who fights you with a street light. I'd tell you about the fight itself, but honestly, I couldn't even tell you what he was doing. Mutants were flooding in, and I could hear his street light, but even on Ultra Nightmare difficulty, which is what I normally played on, he hardly did anything himself, which is a shame because he does have a unique design. After you beat him, you get Nicholas Rain's armor and the Settler pistol, and neither of these are great, to be honest. Rain's armor looks particularly bad. Since practically the entire game is in first person, all you're really going to be seeing is Walker's gloves, and I don't know, he kind of looks like a bum wearing it. I know his base outfit isn't necessarily something unique, but I like the style of it way more than this suit. Also, something else I find funny is they implemented an option to switch outfits, to then only have the base armor and Nick's armor being the only 2 sets, which is kind of a waste, but it is what it is, I guess. Then there's the Settler's pistol. Honest to God, toss this thing in the garbage. The design is interesting, but it's the weakest gun in the game, even below the starting pistol you get. You may think you can at least level it up to make it better, but this thing has no upgrades at all, causing it to just be a waste of a weapon slot. The only other thing added in this was the monster truck, which I guarantee you most people don't even use the thing, and it was thrown in to justify a purchase. So long story short, everything here kind of felt like a miss. And considering this cost as much as the next DLC we'll be talking about, it feels a little little bit overpriced, since everything you walk away with is kinda dog shit.
Your flesh, it can only take so much.
You may be wondering why I don't cover the Rise of Ghost DLC first, considering that is the first DLC. It's because the content difference is so drastic, I feel like I have to. Terramania feels like a Borderlands quest that got lost in the wrong game. Now the base game does have a few goofy moments, mostly just the first MTV encounter, but this DLC starts off with a disc going the wrong way and sucking the player into an alternate dimension. It's a really weird choice for this game, but nothing to really complain about. But then you start the DLC, and you will definitely have some emotion towards it. First, the enemies of this DLC are an army of the dead. Skeletons of every faction you fought so far mashed into one group. Something similar to the Taken for You Destiny folks. Given this was the final DLC, it does add a nice bit of challenge dealing with all these guys at once. The problem is the arenas. You see, in the base game, the battle arenas are a bit more congested than something like Doom's, but not to the point where I'd complain about them. Here, past the first encounter, it feels like any double dash you do will end up with you smacking into a wall. So while visually the areas are pleasing, they are hands down the most irritating ones to fight in the entire game. Maybe that I've ever played in a movement shooter, honestly. Hell, one level consists of alleyways you can hardly dodge down, and another one is a room that shrinks with two big bosses in it. It's like it was intentionally made to be annoying. This issue is 1000% amped by the fact that this DLC doesn't feel like it's balanced for higher difficulties at all. In the entire base game and both the other DLCs, I beat them with great difficulty, but it felt doable. Here, I literally don't believe you could beat this on Ultra Nightmare without cheesing it. There's so many enemies. The enemy types being mashed up doesn't particularly matter to me, but the first area of this DLC has a longer gauntlet than anything in the base game. Everything two-taps you. The areas, as I said, are frustrating, and to top it off, you have to fight 4 mini-bosses in this gauntlet before a huge boss, with no checkpoint in between. It's the most annoying thing I think I've played in a long-ass time, as it doesn't feel like there's anything you can do about any of this. Honestly, I still think it's a miracle that I even beat the first section of this on Ultra Nightmare. But as I said earlier, it felt like it was the only one designed by someone who played anything in this genre before. You may be wondering what else there is to do in this DLC other than combat. Nothing. You're sent here to reassemble that disc I mentioned earlier, but aside from the narrator, you barely speak to anything else that happens in this DLC. So it's really just an excuse for the hardest enemy clumps in the game, which, as I just said, have very obvious problems. But there was also a weapon added, a sword. Laying on its Doom sister project yet again, the sword here is interesting. Just like everything else, it's a bit clunky to use. So, like everything else, it's worse than the shotgun, but it does have potential to be pretty decent. You see, the sword levels up the more gauntlets you beat here. At the start, it's pretty dog shit, being nothing more than a cooler melee attack. However, by the end, it has some unique properties. Most of them, I'd argue, aren't great. You get a dash slash, which is cool, but the fact that it replaces your dash and auto homes in on enemies can leave you in some really weird positions and makes it awkward to use. The sword makes you use shatter from it instead of your palm, which for me made Walker be far back enough where all it would do was lightly nudge the enemies over. You get a bullet deflect block attack, but for some reason, deflected bullets don't hurt enemies. This is probably the most disappointing aspect of it, because that small touch of the enemies dying from your deflect would have made this easily my favorite weapon in the game. Also, even with what they have here, it's a bit finicky, as once you're deflecting, you're locked into that animation and you can't do anything until Walker puts the sword down. So you can't use it smoothly alongside anything else. Where it gets good is its other two abilities. It gets a chargeable gravity slash that freezes enemies in air. It's fine, it can stop a large amount of enemies from advancing towards you, but again, like before with the vortex ability, it's kind of hard to hit them in air, and you're most likely going to get shot by other enemies if you try to swat them out of the air with your sword. But its crowning ability is its charge slash. If you hold R2 for a second, you get the ability to shoot an energy beam that goes through enemies until it hits a wall, and can 3-shot enemies on Ultra Nightmare. Let me remind you, this weapon has no ammo cost, and this move has no cooldown. No other gun can straight attack through walls of enemies like this, so this one aspect of it makes it one of the best weapons in the game. It's a shame it's the only amazing aspect of it, but it's still the best feature of this DLC as a whole. A sword ending up somewhat strong but outclassed by normal weapons due to an odd caveat in a Bethesda shooter. I wonder what they were prepping for. Anyways, I think the worst part of this DLC is the ending, to which I'll just show you my live reaction.
Oh no, you did not just put the credits in a still shot.
That's right. A small animation of a spinning disc followed by a hard cut to an image. It feels like Bethesda's budget for this game just ran out at this moment, and it felt really tacky. Again, another example of this game ending on its lowest point, especially since this was the last DLC this game got.
Feltrite's coursing in my blood!
Rise of Ghosts is probably the best thing to ever happen to this game. First off, it starts with you getting kidnapped, talking to this mysterious figure named Iris, who, as you can see in the cutscene, is another ranger, and as such, she has your abilities. Within her first introduction, she is immediately more interesting than Cross. Don't get me wrong, as I said, I love him, but he's a bit more on the generic side. She seems a bit more complex in her motivations, as she wants to bomb the main wasteland with Feltrite bombs, forcibly mutating them, but also giving them, in her words, the power, strength, and security her and Walker have. And she doesn't even really want to hurt you, telling you to go away and let her finish her plans, purposely leaving you alone for the beginning half of this DLC. Later on, once we step on her toes enough, we get our first boss fight with her, and it's good. As I said earlier, she's a ranger, meaning that she has practically all of the abilities you have. She dashes around, will dodge bullets if you don't stun her first, uses Vortex to jump up and shoot you. She even knows the meta and only uses the shotgun. It's probably the best fight in the entire game. And after all that, it turns out the fight was a distraction so she could go destroy the main hub of the game. This is the kind of shit Cross needed to do. While he does kill Prowley at the start of the game, past that point, he doesn't do much to us actively while we play. With Iris destroying the hub we've been to multiple times during this campaign and seen bustling with life, it really catches you off guard. Unfortunately, someone at Bethesda is allergic to good storytelling, so everyone survives this, but it's a really good scene to show how much of a threat she really is. In a bit of gameplay after that, we get to our final encounter with her. And unlike Cross, this fight doesn't turn into a slogging waste of time that makes the DLC end at its lowest point. It's a repeat of the earlier Iris fight, but she has access to a few more abilities. She seems to have more health, tosses wing sticks at you, will use shatter and ground pound. Hell, once you get her to half, she triggers overdrive. And once you defeat her, remembering that she has all the abilities you have, she uses the defibrillator on herself, causing the fight to continue. Some may say that it's lazy to have the second phase of the fight be pretty much identical to the first, but considering it's the best fight in the entire game, I didn't particularly mind it. After her defeat and attempting to stop you one last time, you will talk for a second in a real nice but simple cutscene of Walker walking towards her as she bleeds out, further emphasizing how Iris doesn't really hate you, she just thinks your methods of saving the wasteland is naive. Afterwards, she asks you as the only other ranger to sit next to her until she eventually bleeds out, leading to you both sitting down and looking out over the city. It's probably the best scene in the game, and the only time I can say this game really ends at a high point. To somewhat get off of the subject of just her alone, she leads a new faction of enemies known as the Ghosts, which are very distinct from the base game factions, as they'll use some of your abilities against you. They'll dash and use their wing sticks in their fights, which helps differentiate them from all the other humanoid enemies in the game. Which also helps, as unlike the Terramania skulls, they're actually balanced. Sure, the rifles still do normal Ultra Nightmare damage, but the wing sticks, which are known for homing in, still only do a small bit of damage, meaning they hinder your movement when they hit you, but they won't just home in and obliterate 50% of your health on hit. We also got a new power and weapon. The power is Void, which I mentioned at the start of this video. It's cool, and while I initially thought it was a waste of a slot, it can actually be pretty helpful. You can use it to grab the last enemy of whatever arena you're in and get free health back, or you can use it as a free way to fling any nearby enemy on any difficulty, meaning you can usually one-shot enemies even on Ultra Nightmare with it. The cooldown's not bad either, meaning it'll most likely become a key part of your arsenal once you get good at using it, though I do wish it was implemented differently. This is more of a nitpick, but Void seems like a very villainous kind of power to use. You hold someone until their head explodes. When I saw it, I imagined he'd learned it from an Iris fight, as it seems like something she would do. But no, she doesn't even have access to the move. And the way you get it is the same way you get access to any other ability, through an arc. Again, not a DLC ruining thing, but it seemed like wasted potential. As for the gun, it's alright. It's functionally a death laser with infinite ammo as long as you kill enemies. It can kill quite fast, even on Ultra Nightmare. So while like most, it's not as good as the combat shotgun, it's pretty decent. Now, despite this DLC being my favorite thing out of the entire game, the other new enemy type is a recycled reskin of the mutants. And while I thought they were a cool concept, they only get 1 or 2 lines talking about them. The characters other than Iris are kind of like the base game. Not bad, but pretty generic. The way this story is handled is a bit clunky, as like before you need to rank up in the faction by doing combat arenas and stuff like that, and then pass a hub city to trigger new dialogue. While this is pretty easy to make happen in the base game since there's quite a few cities that you'll walk in and out of, this DLC only has 1. Meaning if you're good at the game and don't need to restock much, you might be really confused on how to continue the main plot, as I was clearing out places left and right. And right before I finished the DLC, I had done every combat spot to continue the story before I bothered going back to the main hub. Overall, I think Rage 2 is a good game. Some people may say it's a Doom Eternal pretest, which in some regards I do agree with. But at the same time, I feel it's unfair to boil the entire game down to that. There's so much attention to detail and unique mechanics, it feels like it has its own identity. However, I feel everything was just mismanaged. For every single cool, amazing aspect of it, it has one part that really weighs it down. And that really pains me because it's so obvious those working on it care. From the mountains of data pads to fill in the world's lore, the amount of detail on all the models in game, how good the graphics and cutscenes tend to look. It feels like with a few tweaks, this would have been one of the best movement shooters of the year. But due to some odd design choices, it just got stuck at being a good game. And that really pains me to say. Most games I play for review, I beat them once and then delete them off of my system and begin right. But with Rage, I kept playing more and more of it, and I kept noticing more little details that made me love it despite its flaws. But as for you guys, if you like movement shooters, I recommend you at least give it a try. It's relatively cheap nowadays, and I even heard it was free on Xbox Game Pass, so I'd recommend you play it. It's not a game for everyone, but I'm pretty sure many could find something to enjoy here like I did. Anyways, I've said my piece. As always, as long as you guys are respectful, I'm glad to discuss with you in the comments. I've been out, and I am out.